Good morning. So today I'm going to be talking about a pet issue of the alternative right, which is race and IQ. Now, to put aside fears early, I don't consider myself to be a white identitarian, nor do I consider myself to be a member of the alt-right. However, I am very interested in this race and IQ debate. And I'm not a scientist that specializes in this field by any means, so I'm just not going to say whether I believe in the race and IQ thing. But suffice to say that it's an interesting debate, none the least. So the basic premise is that IQ is highly inheritable, and that inheritance will cluster in ethnic groups. And so for non-whites, we'll have a different sort of ethnic IQ score in the average than whites or other ethnic groups, which seems, I think, a fairly reasonable premise, and one that, for the purposes of this video, I will grant. There are two reasons why IQ is an important leg of the alt-right position. Well, there are at least two that I'm going to summarize. There are certainly more. One, it explains racial disparities in Western countries quite well. And it sort of can be used as a shield to block the repeated blows that the progressives mount against the right in the West about these racial disparities between whites and non-whites. Another thing that it does is it explains the phenomenon of sort of cultural suicide by non-white immigration. Now, on the first point, I think that you don't have to be in the alt-right to talk about factors that may influence disparities, for example, in wealth between races, and also that IQ is not the only factor. As a matter of fact, it may not even be the most important factor as far as disparities, for example, in wealth between the races. Another thing is you don't have to be alt-right or white identitarian to want a more restrictive sort of immigration policy to prevent the immigration of people whose culture is antithetical to the home culture and thereby dismantling the home culture. However, as I said, I'm willing to grant the alt-right their premise that, yes, perhaps, their IQ is highly heritable between groups, and the averages stem between groups. So this leads us to a new issue, which is, what do we do with this information? Well, in my mind, there are two ways that we can take the sort of the admonition that race and IQ are connected, if we're willing to make that admission. So, like I said, I'm granting the premise. So the two directions that I would think of is, do human beings have an inherent dignity, or do they not have an inherent dignity? And so the former position would posit some sort of objective moral framework within people are entitled to a certain amount of respect from other people just by the mere fact of being human. So, for example, it is immoral to murder people because they have this inherent human dignity. Now, if you take a more nihilist or sort of moral relativist position that people don't have an inherent human dignity, but it's more socially constructed, then the fixation on IQ as a measure of predictiveness of wealth, of happiness, and so on and so forth, would then suggest that at least part of the alt-right thinks that IQ is directly correlated with a person's worth, or a person's social worth, at least. And so in this framework, you can see how IQ can be tied to value in a utilitarian sense. And because you don't have this objective moral framework whereby people can have inherent dignity, if the dignity is socially constructed, and the way that we're differentiating people is based on IQ, then it necessarily follows that people with high IQ have more value than people with low IQ. This is not, I think, a position that most people in the alternative right take, but it is a position that you can easily argue yourself into given the premise that's just been granted. Right. So let's follow the second premise that people don't have inherent human dignity and that value can be determined by IQ. Well, it leads you to two interesting positions. One is the most obvious one, which is into genocide or the ability to justify genocide of non-white individuals or people who have a lower IQ score than whites on average. And this is obviously a position that the alt-right will not want to argue from. And as a matter of fact, they vociferously argue against the idea that they're in favor of genocide. And I believe most of them. I take them on faith that that is true. However, the argument opens yourself up to that justification. Another interesting thing that it opens you up to is the idea that East Asians, because they have a higher average IQ than whites, are necessarily more valuable than white human beings. And that obviously is anathema to the alt-right project, correct? So I think a lot of alt-righters will not want to take that path. And they may quibble with me on the logic of how this works out, how you can sort of stop short of these positions, but I think in this instance, there is no ideological safeguard between attaching so much value to IQ and then sort of sliding into these other eventualities. I know that that seems like a slippery slope fallacy, but really there is no ideological barrier. So the slope doesn't need to be slippery. You're just going to slide down it naturally, I think. So then you circle back to the other position, which is that human beings do have inherent dignity. Well, if that's true, then forcing non-white people who are already in a country, for example, my neighbor, who is a black man, forcing him or sort of making him feel unwelcome in his own country would be immoral. It would be wrong. And you don't want to argue from a point of immorality, especially when you're trying to claim the moral high ground against progressives. So, again, we're granting this to be true. If that's true, then non-whites who have set roots down in white majority countries, it would be immoral to try to force them out or to try to make them feel so unwelcome that they would want to leave voluntarily. What this means is that an ethnostate by non-violent means would be nigh impossible. So, that is the line of argumentation from human dignity. And I think that is a valuable issue that perhaps the alt-right should consider, is how you square the concept of human dignity with the obsession with race and IQ, and how if you don't find a way to square these positions, it's going to lead you inevitably into outcomes that you've already said you're against and that you don't want to argue for. But anyway, this has been the Hidebound Convivium. Thank you for watching.